Welcome to The Thread, the place for fresh perspectives on Christian leadership, global culture and evangelism in this fast-changing world. Hosted by me, Stephen Foster, and brought to you by Alpha. And I'm so delighted that our guest today is Abel Cheah, Pastor Abel Cheah, the Vicar of Holy Trinity Bukit Bintang in Kuala Lumpur, right at the heart of Malaysia. Abel, it's lovely to have you with us.
It's a privilege. Thanks for having me on.
And Abel, before you took on the church with your wife Jacinta just a few months ago, you were Chief Operating Officer of Alpha Asia Pacific. You're also National Coordinator for Alpha Malaysia. Just say a little bit about what you're seeing in Kuala Lumpur, in Malaysia, in the whole region at the moment, and what you're excited about.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Kuala Lumpur, and we always say that Kuala Lumpur is a city of mixture, and it's a city of outsiders. We've got about 8 million people in the greater Kuala Lumpur area.
Wow.
Half of whom are locals, the other half are internationals. Of the half that are internationals, half of them are migrants and refugees and asylum seekers. The other half are economic migrants or expats. And in our church, that demographic is sort of represented. We've got like 85% locals, the other 15% internationals, and you have both expat workers as well as migrant and asylum seekers. And KL is sort of like a subset and a picture of Malaysia in that sense. We're very mixed. Our history is that of people migrating here.
Yeah.
And I suppose you get to see a bit of that, sort of Asian culture also represented within Malaysia. So Asians are diverse, and there's a sort of fast pace to city life here. But you can see within that diversity all kinds of people, all walks of life. And our church is located at the top of a shopping mall.
Yes.
And so people just stroll in from all kinds of backgrounds.
Oh, wow. And what are you kind of sensing God is up to in the church across the Asia Pacific region at the moment? Because I think there's some exciting things happening.
Yes. There's great opportunities. So only about 9% of Asia knows Jesus. And that means that the harvest is plentiful. It really is. And there's a real sense of hunger and anticipation for what Christianity can offer to this changing continent. We're seeing, rapid growth in terms of the number of churches wanting to use a tool like Alpha.
Yeah.
But it's not just Alpha. It's a culture of evangelism that we're seeing. People, asking more questions. I think the pandemic played a part in sort of displacing people from their comforts and from their traditions, and now people are wondering what more can I look for in terms of hope, for both this world and the life to come. And we're seeing that with the kinds of people, I think just as a pastor in a local church context, the kinds of people who are coming through the doors, a lot of the first-timers are saying that we're here because we have seen you online before, and so we're seeing shifts even in how people are attending church. Previously it was a lot of word of mouth invitations. That's still happening, but first, after the word of mouth invitations, people will be checking out your church online just to sort of snoop around and see what the church is like. So we're seeing a little bit of that now, and it's really exciting. Just last Sunday we got to baptize 30 people.
Wow.
After a run of Alpha. And we're seeing that number, grow. There's a real hunger, and people are taking steps to become followers of Jesus. So we think that this is a really exciting time to be a church in Asia right now.
Amazing, Abel. Amazing. And just say a little bit about your journey of faith. What was the significant thing that helped you draw close to Jesus?
Yeah. So I was born in a family that already believed in Jesus, and that was much to my privilege. But my parents, both my mom and dad, were the first Christian converts of their families. My mom came from a family with 9 siblings.
Wow.
My dad from a family of 4 siblings, both of them Christians for the first time in their family. In my mom's case, she was ostracized. She was kicked out of the home when she became Christian. My dad, actually, funnily enough, he was asked by my dad's parents to go to church to learn English. And so in the history of Christianity in this part of the world, church planting and schools, they often go hand in hand.
Yes.
And we can say a little bit more about what we're sensing about HTBB's future as well as a church. But for my mom, when she became a Christian, it was a very painful episode because she had to leave the house and it was really because of her faith. There was a perception from her parents that my mom had left not just her religion, but her Chinese culture.
Okay.
And so they felt that it was a betrayal, a complete betrayal of her culture. And so they had to, turn her away. That was very painful for her. But when my mom came back to her home, it was actually when her father died. And she was beloved by her father. And when he died, out of grief, she came back to participate in the funeral ceremonies. My mom's family was very pious in the Taoist faith. And so she came and she had this very remarkable experience of joining this funeral, and out of grief, wanting to participate in the ceremonies. But by this point, as a Christian, she felt really conflicted as well. Should I participate with everything in the ceremonies? And so she had this inner tussle. And she tells the story like this. There she was at the end of the line of a long line of siblings. They were all waiting to pay respects and worship the Chinese gods. They raised the joss sticks in the air and then they planted the joss sticks into the pot. My mom was the last in line. It was her turn and she was praying in her heart, Jesus, can I do this? And she said, just one time, let me compromise for this one time out of my love for my dad. So she decides to raise the joss stick to the air. And then she tells it like this, no sooner than when she put the joss stick into the pot, the other joss sticks in the pot jumped out. And it was a supernatural thing that had happened.
Wow.
All her siblings saw this.
Wow.
And they were filled with fear. Actually, they were really frightened. And it was her non-Christian brother who was like chief of all the antagonistic family members who said to the rest, don't make Kayok do this anymore because her Christian God is very powerful.
Wow.
And so when I grew up, I had a lot of stories like this, told by my mom. One of my earliest childhood memories was walking into my mom's room, seeing her worshiping and praying for my sister, Abigail. She was born with Down syndrome 3 years after I was born. And, I grew up in just a culture and an environment where I saw my mom and dad's faith being lived out in very hard circumstances and then hearing stories like this. And it reminds me of, how Paul in the book of Ephesians says, it's by grace that you've been saved.
Yeah.
Not from yourselves, but it's a gift of God. And how faith is a gift that gets to be passed on from one generation to another. So I really feel privileged that my parents, lived out a faith, sometimes in tough circumstances, and then they passed on that gift of faith to us.
Amazing. And how did that extraordinary heritage, how did you come to own it for yourself, Abel? Was there kind of a moment where it became the most important thing in your life? Yeah.
So like any person who's sort of grown up in a Christian home, sometimes you take this faith for granted. And I've had moments when I had, a really hot faith for Jesus, and then I've had really cold moments as well. But I think looking back, when my faith really became my own was when I turned about 12 years old. And it was a guy in my church youth group called Mincer who would come up to my house like every Saturday around 4 p.m. He would drive around, to my neighborhood, and then he would wait outside the car, and just get me into the car and drive me to church. He was the guy who brought me to youth group. And, there were many, I'll admit, there were many Saturdays when I didn't want to show up to youth group, but because Mincer would wait outside my house, driving the car, I would just show. When he was like 16 years old. Okay. I was 12, so about like 4 years older than me.
Yes.
And so he would bring me to church, and I was often reluctant, but just because of Mincer and his sort of faithfulness and his friendship, and I think half the time I was also kind of curious and taken by why is an older guy, and you know how it's like when you're 12 and there's like an older brother who like shouldn't be like curious and nice to you because you're like a different animal, but this guy's like so kind to me. I was just really like taken by that, and so I just sort of followed him to church, and over the years he became like my connect group leader. And he was a real influence. He never really did anything outlandish apart from just being kind, and just paying an interest. And I later on looked back and thought, actually Mincer was just modeling something very healthy and kind about what a Christian leader looks like. He didn't so much teach me as show me what it looks like to be a follower of Christ. And we would trek along in our friendship years to come. And fast forward to when it was time for him to go to university and I was a teenager. I remember one time we were sitting in a connect group. It was the last CG before he went to Australia to study. And he sort of gave us this like little slips of paper. Every one of us in that CG were guys. And on the slip of paper were the words, "I will be found in the house of the Lord." And we were like, what's this, right? And it's like, I want you to keep this in your wallet just as a memento to commit to this. And because he could tell, like, we were all really sad that he was going to go, for the next 4 years. So anyway, we all kept that into our wallets. All of us lost it, 1 year later, but some of us kept that commitment, and I was one of them. And years later, I look back at some of the little things that Mincer did in his quiet leadership that made me sort of rooted in a time when I could have been very displaced in my growing up years.
I love how you put that, Abel, because I know it means a lot to you, the idea of leadership as example over leadership as just content. And why don't you say a bit about that and the power of a lived example as a leader? Yeah.
So Stephen, I read somewhere some time back that there are something like 15,000 books on leadership published in the world every year. So we have no shortage. We have no shortage of leadership material. And I think what we are hungry for, what the world starves for, is not so much more content on leadership, because you can get that easily now. What the world's starving for is examples and real, authentic figures of leadership that you can access and touch and learn from and catch culture from, and not just be taught by.
Yes.
And for me, Mincer modeled that for me. And so that's been my learning about leadership, that leadership is not so much a position, but a posture. And the way that Jesus defines leadership, I find so much comfort and I think it's so wise how he defines leadership in Matthew 20, where in a moment of teaching his two disciples who are jostling for power, he says, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over themselves and exercise authority over themselves. But then he says 4 words to them: not so with you. If anyone wants to be great, they must first be a servant. If they want to be first, they must be a slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to serve, to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. And I think that's what Christian leadership looks like. It's not so much to be first per se, but often to be last, to carry the ladder for others rather than to climb the ladder over others. And therefore, I think our definition of leadership, according to the Christian understanding, modeled after Christ, is that leaders are disciple-making disciples. We're simply people who make other leaders rather than leaders who lord it over others.
Amazing. I love that, Abel. And say you have this phrase, we grow best by loving others and we love best by growing others. Say a bit about that.
Yeah, so we grow best by loving others because there's something in how we were designed by God. We're made to be in community. God himself is perfect community, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so there's something about how we grow to be more like God when we love other people. I mean, Jesus said, didn't he, that the second most important commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. The first is to love the Lord with all you've got. And they're both connected because the measure to which we express our worship to God is related to the measure with which we love his people and love other people. And so to grow to be more like God is to love people better. And then to love people well is to also be invested in their growth, because Jesus said, in his parting words to his disciples, go and make disciples of all nations. When he was restoring Peter, he said, feed my sheep. And so he equated following God and the worship of God with an investment into others, to grow others, not just to love them where they are, but to love them into who they could be. And that's why we love best when we grow other people as well.
And say how you do that, Abel, because you're raising up lots of leaders, and you have these kind of 4 R's of raising up leaders and how you do that well.
Yeah, so, I was reading Matthew's Gospel some years back when Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee, and how he called the 2 fishermen who were brothers. I think they were Simon and Andrew, and how he was reaching people. And then I realized that actually Jesus was a master recruiter. He was a disciple. He was someone who grew. And he was an apprentice. In the sort of physical world, in the world of carpentry and wood making and sort of smith. But also he made disciples. And so when he said, "Go and make disciples," he modeled it for us. And I think leadership development exists on a journey of 4 R's. So reach, recruit, raise, and release. And reach is where, like Jesus walking by the Sea of Galilee, when he recruited his disciples, he went intentionally to the places where he could find his people, where he could find his leaders.
Yes.
There's something about leadership development that is about spotting talent and seeing potential where they might not even see it in themselves. And I think about how in my personal life story, Mincer did that for me. When he came by my house, when I was a 12-year-old, too shy to socialize with anyone, no interest at all in going to church. Mincer was outside of the door. He came by my Sea of Galilee in that sense, and he waited on me, and he just opened the door to his car and shared a space in his car to bring me to church. And I think leadership is about 3 walks. It's walking to Jesus, walking with Jesus, and walking like Jesus. It's evangelism, walking to Jesus. It's discipleship, walking with Jesus, and walking like Jesus is leadership development. And so to start that journey, you have to reach people first, to go where they are. And I think Alpha is a little bit like that. When we host spaces, we are saying, come in, and share this space with us. And we're intentionally inviting people into our worlds and actually going into their worlds as well on their invitation. But then it doesn't stop there, because after Jesus found Simon and Andrew, he then said, "Come and follow me. I'll make you fishers of men." And that's the second R, that's recruit, where he makes the big invitation. And that's audacious. I think audacity is about inviting people and making a bold invitation. With the risk of rejection, actually. So recruiting, in my culture, especially in this part of the world, we don't really like recruiting, because sometimes there's this feeling of, I'm going to trouble you, and or I'm going to put more on your plate, so I don't really want to trouble you. And
so you're tempted to say their no for them.
Exactly. Or just not even trouble you with a question that might put you in a difficult position where you have to say no to me. And so we tend to shy from recruiting, but you're not going to make any leaders if you don't recruit them or invite them. And so I've learned to reframe recruitment not as troubling other people, but giving them the dignity of involvement. And recruitment, I think at the best level and highest degree of recruitment is simply to say, I see in you potential. I see in you great strengths and great gifts. Would you like to come along? And that's what Jesus did to Simon and Andrew, because he said, I see in you that you're fishing for fish. Why don't I make you fishers of men? Join me, come follow me. So that's recruit. And then the third R is raise. And raise has to do with like making that journey. I think of it in terms of 3 stages. I do, we do, you do. Jesus did that with Peter. He modeled to Peter what it looks like to be a teacher, a rabbi, a healer, a leader of a movement. There were many, many fails in the period of raise. So I often say that reach involves a lot of intentionality. Recruit involves a lot of audacity. But raise involves a lot of patience, because you're making that journey from I do, we do, and you do.
And would that be the most transformative stage? Because it feels like that's where you can make the biggest shift. It probably requires the biggest investment.
And it's also I think the longest journey that takes time, and has the most mistakes in. Because as you make that journey from I do to we do, which is where we both do it together, to you do, where there's sort of a sense of delegation, of authority, there's going to be many, many mistakes in between. I read of one estimate that says that in this stage of raising leaders, it takes about 30 times the amount of effort and time to help someone go further than you and get better than you than to do it yourself.
Wow.
Which is why delegating is so difficult. Because it's much easier. I think this rule makes a lot of sense, because it's much easier to do it myself than to teach someone to do it, or to do it even better than me. And the estimate says 30 times, which means that for something that I could do by myself for 5 minutes, it's going to take 150 minutes to help someone do it and surpass me in it. Jesus did that for Peter and Andrew. He navigated many mistakes. Peter failed so many times, denied Jesus. He didn't want to have his feet washed by Jesus. He did many fails, and yet Jesus restored him. He was patient with him, and ultimately he transformed Peter. He changed his name. He said, "On this rock I shall build my church." He was referring to Peter, and so that's race, and that's the journey from I do, we do, to ultimately you do. You can do it, but along the journey there's a lot of feedback, a lot of mistakes, a lot of teaching.
So a leader listening to this, Abel, your advice for them to be, make sure you count the cost and you're prepared to put in the investment, because raise is going to take a lot of your time.
Yes.
So valuable, couldn't be more important, but you're going to have to put in a lot of time to really involve that transformation. And then release. Tell us about
release. Release is the last part of the leadership development journey. So reach, recruit, raise, release. Release, I think, is the one that takes the most humility. Because it's about surrender, and it's about succession, and it's about saying, it's your time, you can do it, or it's yours, you can have it, or you can try again, or you can do more, or you can step up. Someone really challenged me a number of years ago, Stephen, when he asked me, "Abel, do you want to be the best leader there is, or do you want to raise 20 leaders who are better than you?"
Yeah.
And that question really stuck with me. And I think that's the heart behind the principle of release. It's to not just release tasks, but to actually release opportunities, and even to release platforms, and the spotlight, if you will, the opportunity to be the best, so that others can be better than you.
Wow. It's amazing, Abel. And say how you found it in a practical context. You're both someone who's been raised up over the years and someone who's raising up lots of young leaders. And what have been some of the joys and challenges of that?
Yeah. So I had the privilege of shadowing Miles and Sarah. So Miles, as the listeners might know, is the global CEO of Alpha, but he was also the pioneer and the church planter of HTBB, Holy Trinity Bukit Bintang, which I'm the vicar of right now. And for 10 years, he and his wife and the team helped to grow this church. And they invited folks like myself and Jacinta to come along the journey. Actually, Stephen, the journey starts in a very random way, because about 10 years ago, Jacinta and I walked into HTBB in the evening service, a little bit lost, if I'm honest. We were just in a season of transition, in a period of what I would call grief and growth. We were just going through quite a few things. We had been married for 1 year, and we were trying to find church community. And so we chose to come to HTBB, but in the last service of the day, and to sit at the last row in that service. And our plan was very simple. Just come in as inconspicuously as possible, and then go out as inconspicuously as possible. And so we came through the doors. No one greeted us because it was a very new service. We thought, okay, tick, this church,
anonymity.
Yes, this church is going to allow us to be anonymous. And so we sat there at the last row of the church service. And Dan, who was the associate vicar at that time, he was preaching a very simple message, but a beautiful one about the kindness of God, how the kindness of God leads us to repentance. And then he invited people to respond in prayer ministry. He said, if you'd like to respond to this, come up for prayer. We stood up and we walked out the door. We went straight to car park 7B because, we're on the top of a shopping mall.
Yes.
We went into our car, closed the doors, and we wept inside. And that was our first time in HTBB. We just were so filled with sense of God's love, and we were really moved by the simplicity of that message of God's kindness for us. So we said, okay, something's here in this church, let's come back the next week. So we came back in week 2. Again, we sat, but this time like in the second last row of the service. During the time of worship, Miles comes up to Jacinta. We had never met him until this point. He sort of pokes her on the shoulder during the time of worship. He says, I'm sorry for interrupting you right now, but I feel like I've got a word for you. And he then releases this word about how he sensed that she had in her bloodline a revival spark. Yeah. And so she begins to weep because, in Jacinta's story, she comes from a long line of headhunters, from a remote village in Borneo. And there's this story about a revival that took place in her tribe. And so, and God saved them from this past of headhunting and savagery into a really glorious, present and future of, God transforming their entire society. So she begins to weep again because of Miles' word, and we are like, "What's wrong with this church?" You know, for the first 2 weeks of our time here, we're just crying, we're just in buckets, and so we decided not to stop coming, and we just continued to come back. And really, that was how our journey began. And really, we felt like the team had reached us, but in a very gentle and kind way, at a place when we felt like we were grieving and growing, both, you know, at the same time. And then over the years, we were invited to come on Alpha to be hosts and helpers there. And then in 2016, about 1 year later, it was Dan and Kate, Dan, who, you know, was the social vicar at that time, who invited us to come and work at the Alpha Hub. First for me as the national coordinator for Alpha Malaysia, and then for Jacinta with St. Paul's Theological College, Malaysia. And so we said yes, and I left a job that I really loved at that time, Teach for Malaysia, which is an education non-profit organization. But when I joined Alpha Malaysia, it was again another move and a step in the stage on raising, on raising leaders. And that was a challenge for me to also raise other leaders. And so over the years, I've tracked with leaders like Miles and Sarah, who have always spotted other people and who've taken a chance on them. And now we feel like it's our turn to do the same as well.
And it's amazing, Abel, because you and Jacinta have taken on the church in the last few months. And you've been through this succession journey, which I imagine has been, in one sense, slow in terms of long preparation, but sometimes it happens very quickly.
Yes.
And what were some of the things that have been really helpful for you both as you've been prepared for leadership and to lead a church, and how Miles and Sarah have been investing in you?
Yes. So the first lesson we've learned is just to surrender and to trust that God has the whole process in his hand, and just to keep a growth and learning posture along the way. I remember in the second year, so 2016, when we were attending HTBB, by this point we were starting to serve in various ministries. I remember being in a service when Miles was preaching, and the thought crossed my mind, and I thought, I really pity Miles' successor, whoever the poor guy is, years from now, because this guy is so brilliant. Miles is such an amazing communicator, such a brilliant leader. I was like, I really pity the next guy because he will be so disappointing. And of course, I didn't know at that time, but about 10 years later, I would be that guy, right? And so, like, fast forward to March 2025, just about 5 months ago, I begin my sermon like this, you know, as the vicar after the succession. I sort of start my sermon by saying, Jaws 2, Terminator 2, Lord of the Rings 2. There's something about sequels that can be really disappointing. we all know that sequels can be really disappointing. And I think I've learned to just not take myself too seriously and not hold on to the pressure of performance. And I suppose this is to anyone who is about to take on the burdens and the responsibilities and the joys of leadership from another person, to just trust that if God is in it, then ultimately it's the Lord's church, you know, it's the Lord's enterprise, and we just need to be obedient and catch up with what the Spirit is doing. And that's the posture that we want to take. I think humility is not so much to sound modest, because we can all train ourselves to sound modest, but humility is really to have a posture of learning and to always believe that you can keep growing. And if you make mistakes, you can own up to them and you can keep improving. And I think, you know, if growth is measured by a mark of how much you love other people, then actually there's a lot of hope for all of us to keep growing, because you grow best by loving others.
Wow, I love that. And I know Miles and Sarah invested a huge amount of time in you and Jacinta, and proximity and space, and brought you into their lives. And what are some of the real gifts that you feel you've received from them in terms of the way they've led you as leaders, and then how that's inspired you to lead others? Yeah,
I've learned that you can just sort of travel at the pace of grace, you know, from Miles and Sarah. Actually, one of the first few things I noticed about Sarah was that she was deeply embedded in service, and she was very visible in the morning services. But by the evening service, she was not there. And in fact, so for the first year of us being in HTBB, we didn't really see Sarah around. We later on found out that she wasn't around for the evening service because she was at home being with her kids, who were teenagers at the time, helping them with their homework. And I just felt a lot of respect for her, and a lot of permission being granted actually to other leaders who were rising, because she was modeling to us something very healthy about how our ministry is also to our home, first and foremost, to our marriages, to our homes, and then to the church, to ministry and to the teams. So we've learned something healthy from Miles and Sarah, and that has given us some health and flourishing as well. And now we get to do that with other people as well. So we've learned that. We've also learned from Miles and Sarah about leading in proximity, leading as friends. Jesus said, I no longer call you servants, but friends. And I think there's something powerful when you lead among friends, and when you allow friends to lead you as well. There's something humble and flat about that. In our context, Malaysia, this is like fascinating trivia, but there's something called the Hofstad's Power Index, which measures the distance between, in different cultures, the gap between the first in any organization and the last, like the intern or the junior in the organization. Malaysia ranks number 1. I think still, until today, might have changed more of late, but we are very high up on that power index, which means that we're in a culture where there's a high power differential between the ones who have power and the ones who doesn't. But in a church context, we get the privilege of modeling to the world what it looks like to be equal at the foot of the cross, to all be followers of Christ, no matter whatever socioeconomic class or educational background you have. And so, Miles and Sarah modeled that beautifully in the way that they led. And I think the church flourished because of that, this culture of hospitality where we're all valuable, even though we have different roles, and we can treat each other with kindness, because of the kindness that we've been given by the Lord.
And Abel, say a bit about, because I've heard you speak about the power of words and the importance of encouragement as a leader for those you're raising up, and that's something you do brilliantly. But why don't you say a bit about how that began for you and what happened to you in kindergarten?
Yeah. When I was 5, I had a turning point in my development. It was something that would mark me for many years to come, because I was just sitting down and doing some homework in kindergarten when I overheard my teachers talking about me. And actually they were talking about how I wasn't very smart. And one of them happened to know that my mother was a teacher. And so she was actually expressing surprise that the son of a teacher wasn't very smart at all. And of course they didn't know that I was overhearing all of that, and I clocked it, but because I was 5 and I didn't have the language or the tools to respond in any way, I just remembered it and I just carried it for the rest of the next few years of my growing up. And so growing up, I always thought that I was not smart, even though evidence was to the contrary. Actually, I often joke that there was no chance for me to have bad grades being the son of a teacher.
Yes.
Especially in this context where my mom was a tiger mom as well. There were expectations that your grades would only be 90 and above. And so I had good grades. So the evidence was to the contrary, but I felt like I was not smart, and I told myself that I was not smart. So every time I had a good grade and when I had my scholarship to study, I just thought it was all a fluke. And so that sort of shaped me in my opportunities. I sort of discounted myself often with opportunities to do stuff or to put my hand up, to volunteer, to represent the school, etc. I always thought that was someone else's role because not smart, right? Until one day, it was another teacher who sort of broke that. Funny that it was a teacher who first started this cycle of me thinking certain thoughts of myself. And then it was years later when another teacher said something really offhand, and she said, Abel, has anyone told you that you're really quite intelligent? I said, oh, not really. And that, again, a very, very passing remark sort of broke that cycle and that thought pattern in me. And this reminds me actually about an experiment from a US-based university called the SCAR experiment, which I find super fascinating.
The SCAR experiment.
The SCAR experiment. And it's an experiment about the power of words and the power of perception. And in the experiment, participants were invited into this experiment and told that they would be students to study the effect on how the world perceives us based on how we look. And so they came into the lab and they were given very high quality makeup on their faces that looked like scars, like really realistic looking scars. And every one of them had a mirror to look at it. And then the mirrors were removed, and they said, for the final step of this experiment, we're going to just seal up your cheeks so that the scars would be like really sealed. But actually that was a bluff, because the researchers in fact removed the scars from each of their cheeks. But every one of them thought that they still had those high quality like makeup scars on their cheeks. And so out they went and they were given this task to like interact with people outside of the lab to see how they were being responded to and how people would react to them, right? Every one of them thought that they still had a scar. And so when they came back to the lab to report their findings, they all said that everyone that we talked to treated us really rudely. They couldn't stop staring at our scars.
Really?
They were shorter with us when in fact there was nothing on their faces. And I think that, you know, that is such a good example of the power of perception, of how we live up whatever we believe about ourselves. And the power of words, actually, words can really frame your reality. And for me, you know, when my teacher said that I was not smart, that was the frame by which I viewed myself and my entire reality. But when another teacher sort of broke the power of that word, then I was freed from that frame of reality. And in a much larger way, God says things of us that are beautiful, that are good. He views us with love and delight, and he sees us as gifts. You know, Jesus said that we are his gifts of the church, and he came for us because he saw in us a joy before him that allowed him to endure the cross. And so with that, you know, I think Christians can have really healthy self-esteem because ultimately we understand ourselves through the lens of God's love for us.
So inspiring. Yeah, really inspiring, Abel. And would you say a bit about, you've talked about grief and growth. And I wonder how you've navigated seasons of grief in your life and how God's been at work in you through them.
So, you know, that story about Mincer and how he was an early influence in my Christian formation and my understanding of what makes a great leader. It would be years later when Mincer was diagnosed with a very rare form of blood cancer. By this point, he was in his early 30s and I was in my late 20s. And he beat it the first time round through lots of prayer. But in the second time round, he succumbed to it. And Jacinta and I, by this point, we were married and we got to see Mincer on the day before he died. And we were, you know, obviously very sad and grieving this loss. And we got to say our goodbyes and thank yous to him. But even in the way that he died, the word would go around that on the day that he died, he mustered all his strength. He got up from his unconsciousness and he had strength to say only one word. And the word that he chose to say with his last breath was worship. And then he died. And that was very inspiring for us. It helped us to make sense of our grief, you know, because Mincer was this like towering figure in my life. And so that really displaced, you know, me in some ways. But that story really moved me because Mincer's background was that he was an amazing worship leader. And actually for the final 2 years of his life, he couldn't worship lead anymore, in at least the way that we understand worship leaders to be, in front of the stage, etc. Didn't have a guitar in his hand, but with his last breath in his body, he said that word. I suppose to mark to the people around him that that's what he was about to do for the rest of his eternity. And I think in a much larger way, Mincer lived his life as an act of worship to God. You know, his worship was to love people well and to be an amazing leader. And so for me, you know, in that lesson on grief and growth, I think that every time we encounter a loss, or we have to step into something new, or navigate a huge change that has displaced us from something in the past, we're going through two things. We're going through grief, the goodbye of something familiar, and growth, as we say hello to something new and we step into another area of growth of our identity. And I think about that story in Genesis where this guy called Jacob is on the run because he's made a mistake, and he reaches this place. I think we're told in Genesis 28 that he reaches a certain place. So basically a random place. He's got nowhere to go. And we're told that the sun even sets on him and he has nowhere to sleep. So he chooses a stone to rest his head upon. And then he falls asleep in this place of hard stones. And I think that place, that certain place, represents grief for all of us. That place of transition, of displacement, where we don't really know where we are. And Jacob is in that moment. But then what happens afterwards is he has this dream of a ladder that goes up to heaven with angels ascending and descending upon it. And then we're told that the Lord stood over the ladder, and the Lord says to Jacob, that I am with you, I will not leave you, and I will be with you for as long as it takes for my promise to be fulfilled. Jacob wakes up from that dream, and then he's filled with like a sort of reverence and fear, and he says, surely the Lord was in this place, and I was not aware of it. And the lesson of this place of hard rocks is that our entire reality, we must remember that when we are grieving or when we're going through loss, our entire reality is not the same as our entire awareness of the situation. Because when Jacob realizes that God was with him, he then said, the Lord was here, but I was not aware of it. And he calls that place Bethel, the house of God. And so when we're going through seasons of growth and grief, remember that God's with us, that even if we're not aware of where he is, our reality is not bound by our awareness. And often there's more than meets the eye, and that God is behind even the hard stones, and he's with us in those places. And out of that grief, we are growing.
Abel, one of the things I admire about you is the way you lead. And we often talk about leading at the pace of relationship. And I think John Swinton talks about the 3 mile an hour God, that Jesus walked at 3 mile an hour. But you also managed to lead at pace and at relationship as well. So how have you managed to combine those two things, like relationally investing in people, but also having to operate at a certain pace with so much going on?
Yes. So I think Glenn Pakiam defined health as power and pace divided by proximity. And I found that really helpful. Like the more power you have and the more pace you have, like the faster you travel. And, I do believe that the mission of God does come with a degree of pace. I think it was John Wesley who said that even though I'm always in haste, I'm never in a hurry. And there's a difference between haste and hurry. I do think that we're not called to a life of hurry, but there is a certain urgency to our mission. And Jesus did live a very high octane, intentional 3 years of his ministry, but there was also a remarkable period of preparation beforehand. And so power and pace over proximity. The faster you travel and the more power you have, the more important it is for you to do all of that to travel in proximity with others. And there's that African proverb that says that if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. And so I think that it is possible to travel at a certain pace of intentionality and even speed, but together, and to do it, in proximity with others. And sometimes to adjust pace based on the people who are with you as well, to keep you healthy. And so I think what that looks like for us is to make sure that our calendar reflects our values. We have been talking a lot about, modeling that to our team. In fact, just a few days ago, I showed our team at HTBB our calendar in full disclosure. This is how we practice the Sabbath. We work 6 days a week. We have a high work ethic, but we also want you to know that we're very intentional about having deep rest. I believe that intentional leaders modeled after the way of Christ should have a high work ethic and also a high rest ethic.
Yeah.
And that means that we should be a Sabbath people, but also a people of intention and purpose. And so, we're very intentional that when it comes round to Friday and Saturday, that we mark out those moments with family. And then when it's time to work, we're fully in it, and we're missional in our ministry. And then to travel at the pace where everyone is at, and to be very aware of where the heart is, and to be sensitive to where the Spirit is leading us. And that's only possible in proximity.
Yeah.
And so of the 6 days that we work, 2 days we give to meeting people intentionally in church, having coffees and meals with others, trying to do what the ancient church used to do, which is to practice our faith around a dining table. Yeah. We're trying to be intentional about that.
Amazing, Abel. And say a bit about the vision, because you have a 100-year vision. And say a bit
it sounds
about
ridiculous. But the story is that when it became clear to us that we were going to succeed Miles and Sarah, we went away to pray. I think honestly because we felt a certain dread and heaviness with the weight of responsibility. And also, if I'm honest with you, Stephen, a desire not to disappoint. Because I knew immediately that if you're going to succeed a great leader like Miles, you're going to be a disappointing figure at some level. First to yourself, to me, and then to others. And that's always going to be the burden of a successor. To face up to that reality that at some point you're not going to fit within a mold that people might desire for you to be. And I found it really helpful, this definition of leadership, that leadership is to disappoint people at the rate that they can absorb. And so I've learned to sort of be okay, sometimes to not measure up or to please everyone, but to love everyone. That's the real call of a leader. And so the idea, of to go away, going away, I think it was a very good one, because for about 1 week, we just spent some time in prayer. And in that time of prayer, I was asking the Lord, what's the vision for the next 10 years? Because 10 years had already passed for HTBB. And I really felt challenged by the Lord. My sense was that the Lord was challenging me to pray not for the next 10 years, but for the next 100 years. And at first, we sort of laughed about how outlandish it sounds like, because in 100 years, we're all gone. Our children may not even be around anymore. But then we realized that there is a certain wisdom in thinking about a vision that can last for 100 years.
Yeah.
Because when you think in a frame of 100 years, you're now building a long vision rather than a big vision. With a big vision, sometimes it's possible to be quite hollow inside, to be all about speed, but not substance. But with a long vision, you have to go to a certain depth, and you need to build things that last. Yeah. And so when we think in terms of building things that will last for 100 years, we then go back, ironically, to the ancient church. And I think it's Winfield Bevins who said the future church is ancient.
Yes.
And so what does the future church look like? What the ancient church always did well: worship, community, multiplication, and legacy. And so we framed those 4 things as the way to chart vision for the next few years of HTBB's life. To invest in worship and prayer. We'll only go as far as our surrender to the Lord. To invest in community, to get to a level of depth and discipleship within the church, to make resilient leaders who make other leaders. Multiplication, we're not here to just be a holy huddle, but to plant communities of faith and to look out for the last, lost, and least. And then legacy, this idea of 100 years, building things that last, and to live out a kind of faith that will bless not just our generation, but that will build the foundations for the generations to come, even people that we don't yet know.
And that part of it is the mission school.
Yes. So we were really inspired by this idea of building things that will last for 100 years. And so we started to have a bit of a napkin where we started to write dreams on that napkin. And one of the things that we wrote was, because we were thinking, what's going to last in 100 years if we were to build something that will last? And so I wrote the word school, HTBB school, and then put like 2 question marks to it. And And then Jacinta and I were like, really? And that's why I said, yeah, that's why there's a question mark on it, right? But 2 weeks later, we were in a very special conversation where the question was asked, what if HTBB would start a mission school? Wow. Because let's look at what has happened in Malaysia 100 years ago. Like 100 years ago, there were not many Christians in this part of the world. And the faith and the gospel came through a movement of people who believed in not just the conversion of souls, but the transformation of society. Yeah. And so as churches were built, schools were also established. And so we thought that's a really cool idea because we've been praying about this for the last 2 weeks. And so next month in August, we're going to be launching our inaugural cohort of the first batch of school students at the primary level in our mission school. It's called Thesis, and we're really, really excited about this school.
Abel, so much gold, such an inspiring conversation, and thank you so much for your time with us today.
Thanks for your time, Stephen.
And thank you for joining us on The Thread, and we look forward to seeing you next time. The Thread podcast is brought to you by Alpha, the home of curiosity, conversations, and exploring the Christian faith together. If you know someone who's curious about faith, Alpha might just be the space for them. Why not visit alpha.org or follow us on Instagram and share an invite to a course near you.